Hello, welcome back to another installment of Things Doctor Said. We're going to be discussing Dr. J. Bhattacharya again today. As always, this represents just me, not any institution to which I belong. Before we begin, let's review some differences between science and pseudoscience. So this chart comes from the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Let's highlight 4 points. Science follows the evidence wherever it leads. Pseudoscience starts with a conclusion, then works backwards to confirm. Science uses precise terminology with clear definitions. Pseudoscience uses vague jargon to confuse and evade. Science claims are conservative and tentative. Pseudoscience, grandiose claims that go beyond the evidence. Science changes with new evidence. Pseudoscience, dogmatic and unyielding. And let's just highlight that third point again, because that's what we're going to be talking about. The second one, science uses precise terminology with clear definitions. Pseudoscience uses vague jargon to confuse and evade. So let's go with some definitions. So this comes from the frequently asked questions section of the Great Barrington Declaration. They ask the question, what is herd immunity? And they answer, herd immunity occurs when enough people have immunity so that most infected people cannot find new uninfected people to infect, leading to the end of the epidemic pandemic. This means that the epidemic pandemic will end before everyone is infected, although it will continue in endemic form with low rates of infections. This definition is perfectly valid. They're very clear that this is about new cases of COVID with low rates of infections. So if we had herd immunity to COVID, which we do not, it would be like measles or chickenpox, where we would hear about 10 cases here and there in a small little contained outbreak of unvaccinated people without immunity. This is a very reasonable definition of herd immunity. It was the definition that everyone agreed on and most people still agree with. Let me introduce another concept, something called mortality displacement. This is the occurrence of deaths at an earlier time than they would have otherwise occurred, meaning the deaths are displaced from the future into the present, resulting in a changed life expectancy. So this occurs when there's some catastrophe, like a pandemic, a war, tsunami, a famine, where people die earlier than they otherwise would have. And it was always the case that COVID would start to kill fewer people as the pandemic progressed, unless it changed into some much more dangerous, more virulent, deadly form, simply because people can only die once. Once COVID killed its first 1 million victims, by definition, there were 1 million people who were vulnerable to it who were no longer around for the virus to kill. So that is not called herd immunity. Let's return to the frequently asked questions section of the Great Barrington Declaration. They said, do you believe in herd immunity? They said, yes. Herd immunity is a scientifically proven phenomenon. To ask an epidemiologist if they believe in herd immunity is like asking a physicist if they believe in gravity. Those who deny herd immunity may also wish to join the Flat Earth Society. Again, perfectly valid here. So they correctly defined herd immunity, and it is absolutely a real thing. We have, at least at the moment, herd immunity to measles, herd immunity to chickenpox, herd immunity to polio. And let's just listen to how they described herd immunity as being this inevitable sort of thing in October 2020.
Are you advocating a herd immunity strategy?
So herd immunity is not a strategy. Herd immunity is a fact about most infectious diseases, the course that they spread through the population. Even if we were to have an effective vaccine, we would be relying on herd immunity as the endpoint of this infectious disease epidemic. So it's less of a strategy than a recognition of a biological fact. Our aim is not to say we should just do nothing. In fact, that's, I think, the misconception that people have when they hear the words herd immunity strategy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. As both Dr. Kuldorf and Dr. Gupta have emphasized, our strategy involves protecting the vulnerable. Now,
okay, so there we go. So in 2020, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya talked about herd immunity constantly. To hear him talk about the Great Barrington Declaration now, it was just about keeping poor children in schools. But in 2020, and if you actually read the document, it's all about herd immunity. So far, I think what we've heard, there were some problems with this clip that I'll get to, but their definition of herd immunity was valid. And the fact that it's widely accepted is also totally valid. But we heard some problems here. And let's return to the frequently asked questions section of the Great Barrington Declaration. They said, with COVID-19, can herd immunity be avoided? They said no. Sooner or later, herd immunity will be reached either through natural infection or through a combination of vaccinations and natural infection. And this is obviously totally false. We do not have herd immunity to COVID, number one. Number two, we have never had herd immunity to any virus without a vaccine. Why is this? Because babies are not born with natural immunity. So in order to get herd immunity, we need two things. We need a vaccine, and that vaccine has to induce reliable, robust, long-term immunity, which unfortunately our current COVID vaccines do not. But this idea that we could reach herd immunity through natural infection was totally made up and invented. And in fact, those of us who know the history of vaccines are aware of charts like this. These are measles cases in the pre-pandemic era. And as you could see, it would do this jigsaw pattern or sawtooth pattern. It would go up and down every year. It would infect, 800,000 babies one year, and then it would fall the next year as it kind of ran out of babies to infect, and then a new crop would be born. So this is what happened with measles before the vaccine. And it was only with the vaccine that we reached herd immunity. And the measles vaccine, unlike the COVID vaccine, does induce permanent, robust immunity. And it's only with a vaccine that we get to herd immunity. However, in May 2021, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya had very good news to share with the country. He said basically that we had reached herd immunity. A couple months later, the Delta variant arrived. About 6 months later, the Omicron variant arrived. But focus here in this brief little clip about how he defines correctly herd immunity.
Herd immunity means the disease isn't spreading at high rates. Doesn't mean the disease is gone. Right. In that sense, we're kind of already there. The disease has mostly stopped spreading in the U.S. Now, it may come back because this is very clearly a seasonal disease. It's like the other coronavirus is seasonal. It's not surprising this is seasonal. So it may come back. But as long as our older population, the vulnerable, are protected, we no longer have to panic about it.
Okay, so 2 months after this, the Delta variant arrived, and in August 2020, that was the deadliest month of the pandemic for many parts of the country. So he was clearly wrong about COVID being a seasonal disease, and he was also wrong about us basically being at herd immunity, but he defined it correctly there as the disease is not spreading. Now, because Dr. Bhattacharya is unable to admit that the Great Barrington Declaration was incorrect in any sort of way, let's listen to how he redefines herd immunity these days to avoid admitting error. So what you're about to hear here is him just invent a totally new definition of herd immunity that no one has ever thought of before. And again, what he is describing is this concept of mortality displacement, meaning that, yes, we are no longer having 3,000 people a day die of COVID. Let's take a listen.
There was a Harvard study, joint Harvard-Stanford study, with some colleagues of mine. They estimated that 94% of people in the United States have already had COVID and recovered. 94%. What herd immunity looks like, is you've had COVID before and recovered, or maybe you've had the vaccine or whatever. But now, if you get COVID, it's much less likely to produce severe disease and death because you have that immunity. That's what herd immunity is. It's like COVID circulates forever. We don't have any way to stop it. But when you get it, it's not going to kill you. That's what herd immunity is.
Okay. So herd immunity isn't that we get rid of COVID.
It's like trying to say we get rid of the other coronaviruses. They've been circulating for a very long time, and we don't have immunity to those things. Mean it doesn't kill you. You got the first coronavirus you got was when you were a baby, and it produced a little cold because when you're little, you're good at dealing with coronaviruses. But then because your body remembered how to deal with it, the second time you got a coronavirus, it was still a cold. And now every once in a while, every few years, you'll get an OC43 or whatever, and it'll produce a cold because your body remembers how to deal with it.
Okay.
All right. So that is not the definition of herd immunity. A couple other things there. Number one, babies have by far the highest risk, COVID risk of any children. It's like equivalent to a 50 or 60-year-old, for example. So COVID is not this little cold for babies. And also, COVID reinfections are not this benign thing. This study came out this summer. Study suggests reinfections from the virus that caused COVID-19 likely to have similar severity as the original infection. Again, not as many people are dying now because you can only die once. So let's return to this table that I presented at the start. Science uses precise terminology with clear definitions. Pseudoscience uses vague jargon to confuse and evade. So Dr. Bhattacharya correctly defined herd immunity when he wrote the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020. And rather than admit that he was wrong about COVID and wrong about herd immunity, he just created his own new definition to avoid admitting error. And we can return to this last bullet point. Science changes with new evidence. Pseudoscience is dogmatic and unyielding. Thank you very much for listening.